Hey, welcome to Draft Academy. My name is Mike. In this tutorial, I want to talk to you guys about classes and objects in Python. Now, classes and objects are extremely useful in Python programming, and they can help you to make your programs more organized and more powerful. So when we're in Python, we're dealing with all types of data, right? And a lot of times when we're writing programs, we're going to have to work with different types of data. And there's essentially like a few basic types of data we can deal with, usually things like strings, so like plain text, numbers, and Boolean values. Those three are kind of like the main types of data that you're going to be working with in Python. And we have all sorts of structures we can use to store that data, things like lists or dictionaries. But here's the problem, is that not all information, not all data, not all things can be represented using strings, numbers, or Booleans, right? There's a lot of things in the real world that we can't represent in something like a string or just a number, right? In other words, think of something like a phone or a computer or a person, right? You can't really represent those things in like a string or a number. In other words, like the data types that we have available to us in Python can't cover that. And so what we can do with classes and objects is we can essentially create our own data types. So I can create my own data type for anything I want in Python. So I could create like a phone data type, and it could represent a phone. So I could store all the information I would ever want to know about my phone inside of that data type. And in Python, we could create a class for it. And essentially what a class is it's just saying, hey, here's another data type that we want to use in Python. So with a class, you can essentially define your own data type, and it's super awesome. And classes are extremely useful. Classes are used in almost every single major programming language out there. So in this tutorial, I just want to give you guys a basic introduction of classes and using them inside of Python. So let's say that I'm writing a program and I want to represent a student inside of this program. So maybe I'm writing a program for like a college or a university. Let's say that in this program, I want to model a student. Like I want to model a real world object and I want it to be a student, right? Well, we don't have a student data type, and I can't really represent a student in just a single string or a number. So what I can actually do is I can create a class for a student, and I'm basically creating like a student data type. So I'm going to show you guys how we can do that and create our student class. So over here, I'm just going to make a new file. We'll just make it a new Python file. So I'm just going to call it student.py. And inside of this student.py file, I want to create a student class. So the way that I can do that is just by typing class. And now I want to type the name of the class that I want to create. So in our case, we're going to create a class called student. So I'm just going to say student, and now we're going to make a colon. Now everything that goes inside of here is going to be inside of our student class. So everything that's indented like this will be considered a part of our student class. And basically what we can do inside of this student class is we can define a bunch of attributes about a student. So essentially what I'm doing is I'm like modeling a student. I'm creating our student data type. And I can use things like strings, integers, and Booleans in order to map out what a student should be and what a student should have. So I want to create something called an initialize function. And the way I do that is just by typing out def, and I'm just going to type 2 underscores, and then the word init, and then 2 more underscores. And you also want to type out open and close parentheses, and inside of those parentheses, we want to type out self, and then we want a colon after that. What I can do inside of this initialize function is I can basically map out what attributes a student should have. So we can essentially define like, hey, here's the student data type in Python. So what I want to do is add in certain attributes after this self. So I'm just going to say self, a comma, and now we can start thinking about, what values will represent a student inside of our Python program. So if I'm thinking something like name, right? So every student in our program should have a name. They also might want to have a major because they're in college. They probably also will have a GPA, so their grade point average, like how they're doing in school. And let's define one more thing. Let me think. Why don't we make a Boolean, and it's going to be called is on probation. And this will basically tell whether or not the student is on probation. So essentially what I'm doing inside of this initialize method, inside of this init function, is I'm defining what a student is in our program. And so in this program, a student has a name, it has a major, it has a GPA, and it has a value that determines whether or not it's on probation. This right here is the student data type. So if I'm representing a student inside of my program now, it has all of these attributes associated to it. And that's basically what I'm doing up here. Now, inside of this initialize function, we actually have to do something. And basically what I want to do is assign some values. So I'm going to be writing out some stuff, and this might not make total sense right now, but this is going to make sense in a second after we create our first student object. So just stick with me right now and just basically know that we have to do what I'm doing over here. So I'm just going to say self.name is equal to name. And then I'm going to say self.major is equal to major. Self.gpa is equal to GPA. And I'm going to say self.is on probation is equal to is on probation. So again, this might not make a whole lot of sense right now, but in a little bit, this is gonna make total sense. So now that I have this student class defined, I can actually use this class inside of my other files. So I'm gonna come over here into this app.python file, and this is just my main file. And so I actually wanna create a student, right? So in that student class, we defined the student data type, and we basically said like, hey, a student has a name, a major, a GPA, and it says whether or not they're on probation. That's like the template for what a student is. But we can actually create a student. So we can create an actual student and give it some information. And that's called an object. So this student class over here is basically defining what a student is. So a class is just like an overview of what the student data type is. An object is an actual student. So it's an actual student with a name, a major, and a GPA. It's not just this template anymore, it's actually like a student that we're representing inside of our program. So in order to use that student class and create a student object, I actually need to import that. So all I have to do over here is just say from student, and this is referring to this student file. I can say import student. And basically what this is saying is from the student file, I want to import the student class. So even though these are both student, they're referring to different things. So this is referring to the file, and this is referring to the actual student class. So now that we did this, we can create a student. So you can create an object of a class a lot like you would a normal variable. So I can just give it a name. I'm gonna call this student1, and I'm just gonna set it equal to student, and I'm gonna make an open and close parentheses. And now inside of this parentheses, I wanna give this student a name, a major, a GPA, and an is on probation value. So I'm gonna say, we'll just create a fake student. So I'll just say his name's Jim, and he's studying business, and we wanna give him a GPA. So maybe he has like a 3.1. And finally, we want to say whether or not this student is on probation. So why don't we say false? So basically what I'm doing is I'm saying that I want to create a student. So I want to actually create a student object. And remember, an object is just an instance of a class. So the class is like an overall template. It defines what a student is. But an object is an actual student with actual information. So we could call student1 now, this is a student object. So I just want to show you guys what this student object actually is and what we can do with it. And then I'm going to talk some more about that init function from before. So over here, I'm just going to make a print statement. And inside of here, I just want to print out student. And what's cool about this student1 object is I can actually access each of the attributes from inside of this object. So if I wanted to get the name of the student, I could say student1.name. And now this is actually going to print out the student's name. So over here, you'll see it prints out Jim. If I wanted, I could print out the student's GPA, and it's going to print out the student's GPA, 3.1. So now that I created this student object, I can actually access the information about the student. So essentially, I've just created a student data type. So I could create as many of these students as I wanted. If I wanted, I could create another student. We could call it student2. And essentially, we do the same thing. We just give it different information. So we could say like Pam, and her major is art, and she has like a 2.5, and let's say that she is on probation. So now I have another student, student2. So if I wanted, I could access information about that student. We could say like student2.gpa. And now this is giving me the GPA of student2. So basically what I did was I created a student data type and I created student objects, and now I'm able to represent a student inside of my program. So let's talk real quick about all this stuff over here because I didn't really explain it. Basically what's happening is when I come over here and I say student and I'm passing in all of these different values, those are getting passed into this init function. So remember, I passed in a name, I passed in a major, I passed in a GPA. When we create that student, we're actually calling this function. And when I pass in the name, the major, and the GPA, those values are actually getting stored over here in this name, this major, this GPA, etc. Right? So I'm giving this student object all of that information. And down here, what I'm doing is I'm saying self.name is equal to name. And basically what this means is the actual object's name is going to be equal to the name that they passed in. So self.name is an attribute of student, right? So the student is storing a name, the student is storing a major, the student is storing a GPA. But that's different from this name, this major, and this GPA. Remember, these are all just values that I passed in. They're just parameters. And so I need to take the values that I passed in and I need to assign them to the actual attributes of the object. So I need to say, okay, the name of the student is going to be equal to the name that we passed in. One more time. The name of the student object is going to be equal to the name that we passed in. The name of the student's major is going to be equal to the major that we passed in. The student's GPA is going to be equal to the GPA that we passed in. That's basically what's happening here. So when I say self, it's referring to the actual object. So over here, when I'm creating this student object, I'm giving it all of this information. It's taking that information and storing it as attributes for the object. So hopefully that makes sense. I think that's about as clear as I can make it. But the point is that now we have a student data type. So now I can represent a student inside of my Python program. And that's like super powerful. And what's cool about classes and objects is you can do this with anything. So in this example, we created a student class and then we created student objects off of that. But I could model any real world entity into this program. I could model something like a phone, or I could model like a water bottle, or I could model, a keyboard, right? I could model anything that I wanted inside of my program. I could just give it certain attributes, right? And so that's what's cool about classes is we can model real world objects and we can create our own data types. Hey, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and subscribe to Draft Academy to be the first to know when we release new content. Also, we're always looking to improve, so if you have any constructive criticism or questions or anything, leave a comment below. Finally, if you're enjoying Draft Academy and you want to help us grow, head over to draftacademy.com/contribute and invest in our future.